Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a Ukraine war, a US, an EU, a UK geopolitical update. It's going to be about everything. It is a little bit later than I was expecting to be because England had just played Scotland in the rugby, and Scotland actually won fairly handily against England, and I'm not very happy. I may look happy, but deep inside, I am very unhappy. So that happened, and for any Scottish listeners, viewers out there, anyway, we are going to be talking about more serious things than games of rugby, which is, you know, the game for thugs played by gentlemen. And we are going to talk about the Munich Security Conference in particular. It depends how long I bang on about this as to whether I get onto any other topics. I have a list of URLs longer than my arm, considerably longer than my arm. And there is no shortage of topics, of stimuli to talk about. Right, okay. Before we get into it, as ever, please remember to like, subscribe, and share. That would be greatly appreciated. Thank you to all those who have already done so. And thank you to the mods who are no doubt in the live chat. Thank you for already being here and checking out the latest as to what's going on. And my goodness, there's a lot going on at the moment. The Munich Security Conference, I never knew I'd be so interested in. I'm not even sure I knew the Munich Security Conference existed as a thing until like 4 years ago. And now it's just a very prominent, it plays an important part in European and transatlantic partnership politics. And it's an important date in the calendar. My goodness. Okay. I did a video earlier today, and I'm not going to talk much more about Keir Starmer's speech at the Munich Security Conference. I think it was very good. I think he did a very good job at that difficult navigation between wanting to move away from the United States, but recognizing we also need to stay on friendly terms, and we depend on each other, and we will hopefully return to something like the relationship we have experienced in 3 years' time, maybe. But actually, it's not going to be a complete reset. There have been irreversible changes to the dynamics in Europe and around the world. And I thought Keir Starmer did a really good job. I've been on the socials and seen kind of Reform MPs and people like Lembit Opik and other UK politicians slag off Keir Starmer and say, well, if you love Europe that much, why don't you just go and move to Europe? It's like, oh, grow up, guys. So my prediction is that the next election is going to be a rerunning of the Brexit election. But interesting stats that something like, is it 6 million people have died, or 5 million people have died since Brexit, and 6 million people have joined the electoral register, which means and since an awful lot of older people voted Brexit and a lot of young people support the EU, there's an interesting change in political demographics going on there. But I think you can expect a rerun of the Brexit 2016 referendum, and that will invite huge amounts of influence from, I think, Russia particularly. So we need to be putting things in place to stop disinformation. And actually, there's quite a bit of, if we get to it, quite a bit of information about what the UK is trying to do moving forward with regard to international influence in British politics. And that needs to happen. It really bloody does. Okay, so that's done. I think it was a good speech. And I'm really happy that Keir Starmer stood up. And I just, the final thing I'll say in that is, I cannot imagine Nigel Farage saying anything remotely as serious and sensible as what Keir Starmer said and how he said it. I can't imagine Kemi Badenoch doing that either. And for that matter, neither Zach Polanski nor Ed Davey, really. So any of the political leaders in the UK, I actually think Keir Starmer is the strongest in terms of the gravitas it takes to deliver such a speech, and I don't think the ideology from other political leaders in the UK would have manifested itself in anything remotely like what we saw from Keir Starmer. So that was good. Okay, right, let's get on with it. This isn't kind of a Labour Party bloody, PR campaign. So let's go and get on with what I'm supposed to be getting on with. Right. Okay, so here we are. Benny Pie's in the background now, so that's really great. Thanks, Benny, because I've got so many things going through my head. All right, we are going to start with this chap from the 7th Rapid Response Corps. Actually, those guys are responsible for doing a lot of work around Pokrovsk at the moment, I think. So just to give you a bit of an intro to the speeches and who said what, you need to prepare yourselves before war comes to you. In this, we Ukrainians are your best partners because we already live in the future of war. He said, we need to evolve faster than the enemy. The enemy changes every day. If you don't, it kills you. Change or die. The slogan of today's exhibition. But it's not a slogan for Ukraine. It's a warning for Europe. You need to prepare yourselves before war comes to you. And in this, we Ukrainians are your best partners because we already live in the future of war and we pay the highest price for this, the lives of Ukrainian people. Therefore, I do believe you will listen to us. We can help you change faster, change or die. Now, that is, I think, a really well stated position, and actually something that Ursula von der Leyen sort of talked about as well. She talked about the EU needs to evolve or die type thing. Now we're going to go to Jean-Noël Barrot, who I think is a really good advocate here. He is the French foreign minister here speaking at the MSC.
The reason why we've said that we should not exclude to have direct conversations with Moscow is that, Europeans are now the only providers or almost the sole providers of funding to Ukraine. They provide virtually all or almost all of the intelligence and military support. So they have
really important to say we are providing all or almost all of the support to Ukraine now, Europe. I mean, you can talk about Canada and Japan and Australia, etc. But I think the point of this is to say the US isn't doing this, and that includes almost all of the intelligence as well. So interesting.
A lot of skin in the game, and at some point they also need to have, independent contact with the two parties, whether it's Ukraine and whether it's Russia. Add to that there can be, as President Macron put it yesterday, no peace without Europeans, no sanction lifting, no reconstruction funding, no security guarantees. And I just want to emphasize this point. There is no security guarantees outside of the coalition of the willing. At least I don't see any alternative to what the coalition of the willing has put together in close coordination with NATO and with the United States of America.
This is really important, is to say that Europe needs to be at the bloody table here. And we're going to come on later to the fact that China have also said this. Some fascinating statements from the Minister of Foreign Affairs for China saying Europe needs to be at the table. Jean-Noël Barrot here is saying Europe needs to be at the table. We're providing all of the military aid. We're providing all of the intelligence, give or take, or almost all of the intelligence. And, this is a European war. You keep telling us that we need to sort out European security. This is our war. Okay, well, then we need to be at the table when it comes to sorting it out. But of course, the US is bilaterally sorting out the end of this war with Russia to the exclusion of Europe, but also Ukraine.
We've had in Ukraine peace agreements and ceasefire agreements in Budapest, in Minsk, without security guarantees or without genuine security guarantees, without genuine regeneration of the Ukrainian army, without military everyone now, and in some sense, including of Russia, to accept that within a ceasefire and then peace agreement, the security guarantees that have been tailored by the coalition of the willing can be deployed.
Okay, good stuff there from him. Now, if there's a picture that really speaks to this Munich Security Conference, for me personally, it's this picture. And this is coming from Friedrich Merz himself. So he posts this picture, which is a strong handshake between him and Emmanuel Macron. The French and the Germans haven't always seen eye to eye, but it's this desire to have a strong united Europe. And you've got the E3 here, but you've got Starmer from outside the EU and Friedrich Merz and Emmanuel Macron together for a strong Europe. This is essentially what I'm reading from the Munich Security Conference, and that is in the context of the United States as well. So Marco Rubio skipped a key meeting with European leaders on Ukraine in Munich. I think he is going to be meeting with Zelenskyy, but the meeting that was supposed to be between the Americans, the Europeans, and Zelenskyy, he skipped it. That pretty much tells you everything. So we're going to be talking about how wonderful Marco Rubio's speech was. I don't think it particularly was, but it was a step away from JD Vance. But really, it's business as usual, where the Americans aren't interested in Europe, particularly. I say the Americans to the Trump administration. They're interested in doing deals with Russia bilaterally. European officials viewed the move as a sign that Washington is losing interest in coordinating closely with its allies on ending the war. One EU official called the decision insane, and another said the meeting lacked substance without US participation. So this is on, of course, the back of JD Vance not even coming to. JD Vance was supposed to come to the Munich Security Conference and I assume deliver the speech that Rubio delivered, but everyone in Europe thinks JD Vance is an absolute tool. So Marco Rubio, who's the adult in the room, came along and said things were much more polite to the Europeans, and everyone stood up and gave him a round of applause. But actually, when you look in detail at what he said, it wasn't that great. Okay, we're going to come on to that, though. Let's go to Senator Mark Kelly, who has been attacked by Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of War for the American government, who has tried to remove his or tried to lessen his pension. This is because him and 5 other veteran Democrats released a video that said, basically, if you are in the armed forces or the FBI or whoever, or in the armed forces, you don't have to. And CIA, that was it. You don't have to follow orders if they're illegal. So all they were doing was reiterating the law as it already stands. And as a result, the DOJ has tried to indict all 6 of them. The courts have thrown that out, but that shows you the weaponization of the American legal system. And then Pete Hegseth has now taken this guy's pension down, which looks like that might be also thrown out as well. But anyway, Mark Kelly here is on the money. This is a CNN interview at the front end of the Munich Security Conference.
Well, let me start by saying, I couldn't hear exactly what Secretary Rubio was saying, but he was talking about the global world order has changed. Well, it changed for a reason.
Somebody said, quote, the old world is gone.
The old world's gone because Donald Trump blew it up. I mean, we had this system of alliances we've had around the world, especially here in Europe, that has served us as a country so well for decades, since World War II. And, granted, I don't think previous administrations did a great job explaining to the American people why this is so important to our safety, to our economic security, to the future of the planet. It is really important that we as a nation have friends. We've got a rising China. Technologically, they are more than competitive with us right now, and the industrialization and their ability to build things surpasses ours, by a lot. We're trying to catch up. We're trying to do all kinds of things. The thing that keeps us ahead is we have friends, or we had them. What I'm hearing now is, even if we are able to repair these relationships, it's going to take generations before they feel comfortable. We could have a new administration here in 3 years, or Democrats can win the election. There could be a change in the House or the Senate. But what happens 4 years later? I mean, they are now. I got to say, what I'm hearing here in Munich, it feels like some PTSD. Is the kind of vibe that we are getting from our former friends.
That's on the money. And you could argue that there was an appetite for European leaders and people in the room to have a Marco Rubio say something vaguely sensible. And when he did, they all just, there was a collective sigh of relief, right? And a standing ovation type thing. But in reality, you know, Marco Rubio was saying essentially what Trump has been saying, but just in politer terms. So, you know, some takeaways from the whole Munich conference yesterday, or Munich Security conference. Putin has suffered a strategic defeat. Ukraine is winning, say some. A rules-based international order is over. Germany will build the strongest army in the EU. So a lot to come from Germany and also France. EU must become a geopolitical power, which includes a French nuclear deterrent. So there are lots of big ideas to consider. Now, before the MSC, the Munich Security Conference, this was Emmanuel Macron. I'm going to play this because I think this tees us up really nicely.
And look at the situation. China is an authoritarian regime. I mean, no offense. This is their collective choice. And US is becoming an unpredictable economy and governance for companies and sometimes for countries. At the middle of that, you have the European Union. And it remains a place where rule of law and predictability remains valid. I suggest you to pitch that for your investors, because if we are able to fix what we are discussing on the short run, what I mentioned is an extremely important leverage for our future.
So just to translate this, speaking to industry, I presume here, he's saying, look, if we can change a few things, regulation, this or that, or whatever, like if we invest in Europe, you've got predictability in the rule of law. If you don't have predictability from the United States, then investing in the United States becomes more of a high risk pastime. And you don't have the rule of law with China. It's an authoritarian regime, et cetera, et cetera. You're not going to be investing in China. It's kind of a closed system. So Europe is your place to be. And we are caught between China and the United States. And I think that's really well elucidated here by Emmanuel Macron.
Because this is our ability to remain an anchor geography for a lot of investors, because it means we are not hectic, we are not unpredictable. Sometimes, indeed, it takes time for us to fix some issues. But we are here, well-known and reliable. And when you want to be the garant in last resort of a system, it's much better to be in this position. And this is why I believe in my Eurobond. Because when you provide to the market safe and liquid asset and you are predictable, it's extremely attractive. And this is the right moment to do so. But don't underestimate that for yourself and for our continent. Thank you.
So you talk about Eurobonds and getting people to invest in Europe, in say, European debt there. So this is him at the MSC then. And again, this is just a 25-second clip, but I think it's also, he's on point.
As all the allies, we have to be the one to negotiate this new architecture of security for Europe the day after, because our geography will not change. We will live with Russia at the same place and the Europeans at the same place. And I don't want this negotiation to be organized by somebody else, as the Europeans.
We're Europeans. Ukraine are European, geographically. Russia's on the edge of Europe. And we want to negotiate the end to the war ourselves. We don't want it done by someone else. It's this idea that we need to be at the table and the US needs to understand that we should be at the table. So some of the things he said, it's logical to develop the future combat air system together with Germany and Spain. So he's still trying to do that, although Germany's looking at doing the one with Italy, the UK and Japan. It's logical to pursue concrete projects such as next generation air defense systems together with Italy and the UK. It's logical to have early warning systems such as our initiative with Germany. If this funding is used only to seek national solutions or to favor national players without a clear European approach that involves creating European standards, strengthening Europe and helping countries build additional industrial capacity, we will simply waste both money and time and destroy these synergies. That would be a massive mistake. These days, I may appear old-fashioned, but I believe in FCAS. I believe in joint projects and in a certain stage of new generation systems, because it's difficult for me to understand how we can build new command solutions if we dismantle the little we already have. I apologize for saying this. So he's trying to like go for a particular project there, but in general, there's a talk about, you know, pan-European projects, investing in Europe. And he talked about in part of his speech, it was really good. He talked about you know, when I talk about the success of, you know, when I talk about economic success and military success, or military, you know, ideas of security, I'm always talking about Europe. So although he's a French president, he's very much a European. He's always advocating for the EU, and he kind of mentioned that in his speech, where like I forget the exact phraseology there, but you know, I think as an international politician, I can't speak for what he does, you know, domestically, but I think Emmanuel Macron is saying a lot of the right things and has done for some time. I've been quite a fan of him internationally for a couple of years now, and I think it'll be a sad loss to France internationally, like if they swap him out for someone like Jordan Bardella, some kind of Eurosceptic ultra nationalist. And but the other option might be someone from the far left, Mélenchon, or someone in France. And I think I've got a lot of time for someone who's center right here, advocating for European unity. Here he is talking again.
And we have to re-articulate nuclear deterrence in this approach. And this is why we are conceiving, and in a few weeks' time I will detail that, but we engaged a strategic dialogue, obviously with Chancellor Merz, but with few European leaders, in order to see how we can articulate our national doctrine, which is guaranteed and controlled by the Constitution, with special cooperation, common exercises, and common security interests with some key countries.
This is actually one of the most important things that have come out of the Munich Security Conference, as according to a number of analysts. And Keir Starmer talked about this as well. He said, I've been, you know, chatting with France, and it looks like France and the UK, like the UK has always used its nuclear deterrent on behalf of NATO, but France has always been a bit standoffish, and, you know, we'll use it for our own ends. It's got nothing to do with the United States. It's our own independent individual nuclear deterrent system. But there's this move to have France and arguably the UK acting as a nuclear deterrent umbrella for Europe. And that is a really significant shift there, which is, I don't know, not so much moving away from NATO, but moving away from an American nuclear, the American nuclear umbrella, whether you'll see gradually American military move out of Europe and back to United States. I think that's probably like.
This is exactly what we are doing for the first time in history with Germany. And I think this dialogue is important by itself, but it's important because this is a way to articulate nuclear deterrence in a holistic approach of defense and security. And this is a way to create convergence in our strategic approach and strategic culture between Germany and France. And I think...
So the Germans and the French definitely getting closer.
For me, it's very important.
Okay, so then we are going to move on to Germany. There's lots more from Macron, but I can only pick out a few things, otherwise we'll be here forever. If you want to know how bad things are, just listen to Friedrich Merz. He's not even trying to be diplomatic anymore. He's basically saying the American century is dead and buried, and he's pointing the finger right at Mar-a-Lago for killing it. He said, and he says this in German here. He speaks in German, then he flips to English at one point. But if there was a unipolar moment after the fall of the Berlin Wall, it is long gone. The United States' claim to leadership is being challenged. Perhaps it has already been squandered. So he's talking about leadership in the Western world. Europe needs to step up, and Germany certainly is doing that. As Michaela Kerfner says, the gloves are off in transatlantic relations. Quote, the United States' claim to world leadership is challenged, maybe even already lost. Merz openly questions US strength in Munich Security Conference opening speech. He also stresses Europe's dependence on the US as a tough geopolitical reality. So this is kind of what Keir Starmer was saying, that, you know, we are integrated with the American security architecture in a way that, like, it's just a reality. There's no hard divorce from the US. And, in 3 years' time, there could be a Democrat president that comes in that may have a completely different approach to what Donald Trump has. And, it's not to say that there'll be a complete reset. Things are irreversibly changed now. Things have changed. But, it's not that now the relationship with the US is completely defunct. There's still utility there, and there's a lot of work to be done together. So it's about Keir Starmer's speech was all about Europe standing up at its own 2 feet and looking after itself and not having over dependence on the US, but having interdependence. You both rely on each other and you both work collegiately. Chancellor switches from a mostly German speech then to English to send a message to the US. He said, even the US will not be powerful enough to go it alone. Being a part of NATO is not only Europe's competitive advantage, it's also the United States' competitive advantage. So let's repair transatlantic trust together. We, the Europeans, are doing our part. And Kaja Kallas also mentioned this. We're going to come on to that in a second, because there's a lovely exchange between Kaja Kallas and Mike Waltz, the former national security advisor, who's now, I think, is he not something to do with NATO? UN, he's one of the ambassadors to UN or something now. Anyway, this is going back to the idea of adapt or die. This is Ursula von der Leyen on behalf of the EU.
And they say in Ukraine, you change or die. We must adopt this mantra too. We need to tear down the rigid wall between the civilian and defense sector. Europe is a powerhouse. And they say in Ukraine, you change.
So you change or die. So the EU needs to adapt. Now, here we have Mike Waltz talking.
Why hasn't the UN been able to resolve?
Kaja Kallas then coming back in. I've got two to show you with Kaja Kallas, though. One where you see her reacting to what. So I'm going to play you the response first from Kaja Kallas, I think, and then I'm going to show you him speaking and then her reacting, because it's diamond.
Why hasn't the UN been able to resolve issues like a border dispute between Cambodia and Thailand, or Azerbaijan, Armenia, or we could walk around the world, or Kashmir and India and Pakistan, where we faced a very serious nuclear escalation. So what I'm hearing outside of...
there it is. Sorry, I've got it the wrong way round. So this is the full one, actually. We'll start with the full one. Look at her face. It's the idea that, so he's repeating the Trump stuff of like, I've stopped 8 different wars, right? The whole idea that, where's the UN been? Which is fair enough. The UN is fairly toothless at the moment. But he's saying, where's the UN been? We've gone and sorted out all this stuff. And of course, that's not really what they've done. There's been lots of fact-checking concerning the claims of stopping 8 wars, and now he's starting to say that he stopped 3 nuclear wars. It's just absolutely ridiculous. But anyway, this is Mike Waltz saying all of Trump's rhetoric here, and Kaja Kallas not having any of it.
A very serious nuclear escalation. So what I'm hearing outside of forums like this privately is, thank you for American leadership. America has to lead. If we have to have more focused plurilateral or focused multilateral organizations to do so, I think that should be perfectly acceptable if we're getting the results that results in peace and security. Why hasn't...
So she was not happy with that, and her response here is this.
What is actually the difference? When, for example, Russia goes to war, they go alone because they don't have allies. When America goes to wars, then a lot of us go with you, and we lose our people on the way. So that means that you also need us in your to be this superpower. Because if you look at the bigger picture, I mean, in terms of economic might, China is a very, very powerful country. What is actually the difference?
So the idea here is you're a big superpower. China's a big superpower economically these days. When Russia goes to war, no one comes and fights with them, North Korea notwithstanding. But when the US goes to war, if NATO 5 is invoked, we will come with you, as we have done, and we lose people doing that. We lose our people. So don't forget that. And that's kind of real pointed comment with regard to what Trump said recently about NATO and troops, standing far behind the lines, so on and so forth. So there's a very interesting exchange there. Now, like I mentioned earlier, the Chinese foreign minister has also talked about how Europe should be at the center of negotiations. So Wang Yi said the door to dialogue on Ukraine is open and all sides must work toward a comprehensive and lasting peace that addresses root causes. He stressed China is not a direct party and only supports negotiations, and said Europe should be at the table and not on the menu. The classic mantra that if you're not at the table, you are on the menu. You are the one being carved up. So if Ukraine is not at the table, it's because they're being carved up by the US and Russia. And if Europe is not at the table, it's because it's also being taken advantage of and consumed in the negotiations. So that China comes out and says all this, I think, is incredibly, incredibly important. So as I said, the door to dialogue is open in Ukraine. All parties should try to reach a comprehensive and durable peace agreement and remove the root causes of the conflict. Unfortunately, that's very much Russian rhetoric going on there, root causes of the conflict. China is not a party directly involved. We do not have the final say. Europe should not watch this from the sidelines. Last year, when engagement with Russia began, Europe seemed to be left watching from the sidelines. And I said that since the conflict broke out here in Europe, Europe has every right to participate in negotiations in due course. I said that Europe should not be on the menu, but at the table. Now we see that Europe has found the courage to talk with Russia. This is good, and we support it. Now, that is absolutely bang on from China. Part of me, the real cynic in me, wonders whether this is throwing the cat amongst the pigeons. China saying Europe should be at the table, just to throw that into the Europe-US fractious relationship. China is now advocating for Europe, and that then isolates the US even more, as China is almost advocating for Europe. And it's even more divisive. It's very clever because it's not only the right thing to say, but it's also going to annoy the Americans. So that could be part of what China was trying to achieve there. Right. Okay. Just to say this is a really common statement. So Hazel Flats says Macron spent months talking with Russia. We found out later. So at the beginning of the war, we understood that this was, I even reported this as Macron trying to be the kingmaker and trying to make himself as important as possible. And look at me, I'm trying to sort out the war by speaking to Putin. As it turns out, we found out later, and not everyone seems to know this, but he was asked to do that by Zelenskyy. Zelenskyy asked Macron to speak with Russia, to advocate on behalf of Ukraine to Russia, as they needed a friendly ally to negotiate on their behalf. So don't think that Macron necessarily was doing that and to try and self-aggrandize and it was all about him. Actually, we understand that now that was requested by Zelenskyy. So anyway, we're going to go to Rubio talking, I presume, before he made his speech.
The world is changing very fast right in front of us. The old world is gone, frankly. The world.
Okay, the audio is not very good there, so I'll read it. So the world is changing very fast right in front of us. The old world is gone. We live in a new era in geopolitics, and it's going to require all of us to sort of re-examine what that looks like and what our role is going to be. That's what Senator Mark Kelly was responding to, the idea that there's this new world order. The old world is gone, but as Mark Kelly said, well, that's because the US blew the old world up. You know, that's gone because of Trump, essentially. Right. So Rubio gets his standing ovation, as you can see here. But I wonder if a lot of that is based on maybe how it ended. So the very end of, if I look at the transcript here, the very end is, and so this is why we Americans may sometimes come off as a little direct and urgent in our counsel. This is why President Trump demands seriousness and reciprocity from our friends here in Europe. This is why, my friends, is because the reason why, my friends, is because we care deeply. We care deeply about your future and ours. And if at times we disagree, our disagreements come from our profound sense of concern about a Europe with which we are connected, not just economically, not just militarily. So that's a very nice way to end what he said there. And that you often have the recency bias, your proximity bias. So the last thing you heard is what gives you, that's why you end a speech off, as positively as possible with your key kind of demands or your key element that you want to express. So here it's about, I think, Marco Rubio, sorry, his name just completely went there. This is why, Marco Rubio's, I think, key goal here was not to be JD Vance, right? His goal was to be the good cop to JD Vance's bad cop, right? But if you end a speech nicely and everyone stands up and gives you a standing ovation, it's not necessarily that the whole thing was actually like that. And when we look at the speech and the transcript, I think it's fairly typical, kind of almost Trumpian in its structure and in what it was trying to say. So here, Visioner says, Putin's dream, which involves the collapse of the transatlantic unity between the US and Europe and the sowing of alienation between them, was shattered by the US Secretary of State a few hours ago during his historic speech at the Munich conference. Marco Rubio on the unity of Europe and America. Your future and ours is very important to us, and if we sometimes argue, our disagreement stems from a deep feeling of care for Europe, to which we are connected not only economically or militarily, we are connected spiritually and culturally. So that was the end of his speech. We want Europe to be strong. We believe that Europe must save itself because the two great wars of the last century serve as a constant reminder of history. Ultimately, our fate is intertwined and will always be intertwined with yours. Deindustrialization was not inevitable. It was a conscious political choice, an economic initiative ongoing for decades that drained wealth and power from our nations. Mass migration was not and is not a minor secondary issue. It was and remains a crisis that transforms and destabilizes societies throughout the West. So actually what you're seeing is part of the national security strategy, just said in more polite terms, right? So sort of saying that mass migration is an issue and it's an issue for you guys. We're doing ICE and we're trying to sort it out over here by, arresting people willy-nilly on the streets. You guys need to sort that out in Europe. Together, we can not only regain control over our industries and supply chains, but also achieve prosperity in the fields that define our 21st century. But if we also regain control over our national borders, but we must also regain control. This is not an expression of xenophobia. This is not hatred. This is a fundamental act of national sovereignty. And failure to do so is not only a denial of the most basic duty to our people, it's an urgent threat to the structure of the societies and the very survival of our civilization. We do not need to abandon the system of international cooperation that we ourselves created, nor do we need to dismantle the global institutions of the old order that we built together, but they need reform. For example, the UN still has enormous potential to be a force for good in the world, but we cannot ignore the fact that it is not offered real answers to the most acute issues we face today and has in fact played no role. Of course, this just leads into the board of peace and ideas that Trump has to kind of replace it. It did not resolve the war in Gaza. I mean, it's true though, the UN also has huge weaknesses in being able to kind of get anything done, partly because you've got permanent seats on the Security Council, including Russia. Anyway, instead, it was American leadership that freed prisoners from barbarians and helped establish a fragile truce. Of course, he's forgetting that it was American weapons that helped commit genocide in Gaza. But anyway, that aside, it has not resolved the war in Ukraine. American leadership and partnership with many of the countries represented here today became necessary to bring both sides to the negotiating table, still in search of a vague peace. We can no longer allow those who clearly and openly threaten our citizens, so on and so forth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm here today to clearly declare America is shaping a path to a century of new prosperity. And once again, we want to do this with you, our dear allies and oldest friends. Yesterday is over, the future is inevitable, and our shared destiny awaits us. So on and so forth. Now, Anne Applebaum says, Rubio just made a speech to the European defense community in Munich that did not mention Ukraine or democracy or US business deals with Russia. Or the administration's plan to support the European far right. But there were lots of nice words about our common civilization. He did mention it in the Q&A, but, you know, essentially, don't get sucked in by what Rubio said. Andrew Fox says, a masterclass in diplomatic gaslighting from the Americans in Munich today. Too many European commentators behaving like battered wives. Oh, he still loves us. He didn't mean it. He won't do it again. He just gets like that sometimes. Wake up. And this idea of good cop, bad cop, where you've got JD Vance, the bad cop in Munich Security Conference 2025, and good cop Marco Rubio blowing kisses. But actually, when you look down into some of that rhetoric, it was, you know, quite troubling. I've highlighted just a bit here towards the end of the speech where he said, but the euphoria of this triumph led us to a dangerous delusion. So there's a delusion. What's that delusion? That we had entered, quote, the end of history, that every nation would now be a liberal democracy. So this is kind of, is it Fukuyama talking about the end of history, like liberal democracy is here to stay. That the ties formed by trade and by commerce alone would now replace nationhood, that the rules-based global order, an overused term, would now replace the national interest, and that we would now live in a world without borders where everyone became a citizen of the world. This was a foolish idea that ignored both human nature and it ignored the lessons of over 5,000 years of recorded human history, and it has cost us dearly. So this is him saying that although the liberal democracy idea of the world hasn't actually taken hold successfully, there are autocracies like Russia and China, for example. But the point that I keep making is that the US is going in that direction. And this kind of rhetoric is like, well, that was a delusion. And actually, when you look at recorded human history, actually, we need to embrace our nationalistic ideals. I think what he's saying here is quite Trumpian and quite imperialistic. So he says, in this delusion, we embrace the dogmatic vision of free and unfettered trade. Oh, what's a free trade is now not cool. Because for the last 50 years, that's what the Republican Party was advocating for. So it looks like you are just advocating Trumpian protectionism and tariffs, and you can't have free trade. This is so anathema to what Marco Rubio would have said like 10 years ago. Even as some nations protected their economies and subsidized their companies to systematically undercut ours, shuttering our plants, resulting in large parts of our societies being deindustrialized, shipping millions of working and middle-class jobs overseas, and handing control of our critical supply chains to both adversaries and rivals. Now, part of this is a problem that if you allow places like China to completely dominate the market and they subsidize their businesses from the central government, then there is a problem. That's why you do need sensible regulation. But where you do that through kind of sensible tariffs. But what the US has done, like you could think that's quite sensible. He's having a go at, say, China undercutting the American market. But what the US has done is attack its allies and has attacked Canada and Mexico and the EU and the UK and its friends, and whacked trade tariffs and barriers to entry to the markets on people that you were doing otherwise fairly normal free trade with. So this is all a bit of a mess, in my opinion. We increasingly outsourced our sovereignty to international institutions, while many nations invested in massive welfare states at the cost of maintaining the ability to defend themselves. So now he's having a go at the post-war situation in Europe. So what happened is the US pushed its defense expenditure up. I've said this many times to you, but the US moved into Europe literally with armed forces and bases in order to stop the spread of communism into Eastern Europe, so that in the post-war destruction, the European nations could pick up the pieces and spend money on rebuilding and restructuring their societies and nations due to the destruction of Nazi Germany. The US comes to help. The US then starts spending inordinate amounts of money on its own defense infrastructure as a way, and it creates an entire economy out of that. And so it's really annoying now that they say, hey, hang on, you've not been spending enough on defense, but we've been spending loads to help defend you, without realizing that, yeah, but that was your plan. You planned on Europe finding itself again, and then you get to export security and you get a return on investment from that. Like I've said to you so many times, Perun has done a really good video on this. Like, you've spent decades having your military expenditure at the heart of your economy, and then going and projecting your power out in the world with hard power and then soft power, and then you get the dollar as the international currency of trade. You get trade deals that are built on the foundation of your security architecture, so on and so forth. Like, don't come along and you know, have a go at Europe for the situation that you brought about yourselves. Now, for successive presidents, they've tried to get Europe to stand up more independently in terms of security spending, defense expenditure, and that is now happening. But that comes with a cost. Like I've said many times before, if Europe stands up on its own 2 feet, it will not be buying American kit by and large. It will be buying European kit, and we're seeing that. And it will be not wanting American satellites. It will want European satellites, and it will not wanting American tech. It will want European tech sovereignty. And we're going to see this in a second. So, if the more you push Europe to spend more its own defense, the less powerful the United States of America will be in the world. And that's necessarily the way it goes. Now, if you still want that, that's cool. But don't come and just slag us off for not spending enough on defense, which, yeah, there is some justification for that, without understanding that that was still to your benefit. It was still, you got to rule NATO. NATO is your thing, and it has been, and you've used it as a tool. Like Article 5 invoked after 9/11 was to help the United States. It was your thing. And European soldiers died for your thing, right? So I really have an issue with this. And this is essentially Trumpism. He then says, this, even as other countries have invested in the most rapid military build-up in all of human history and have not hesitated to use hard power to pursue their own interests, to appease a climate cult. So now we're getting anti-climate stuff. And by the way, one of the things I was going to talk about later, and this is like super worrying. Some of you might not be too bothered. It depends where you sit with regards to, climate change, so on and so forth. But the US, I believe, breaking news, the Trump administration repealed the bedrock scientific finding that greenhouse gases threaten human life and well-being, meaning the EPA can no longer regulate them. So now the Environmental Protection Agency in the US can no longer regulate for climate change. Essentially, the US has now officially given up on climate change. And so you've got Rubio then coming to the Munich Security Conference and saying, to appease the climate cult, we have imposed energy policies on ourselves that are impoverishing our people, even as our competitors exploit oil and coal and natural gas and anything else, not just to power their economies, but to use as leverage against our own. But of course, China is the world leader in renewables. So again, this is a mess of ideology. And in a pursuit of a world without borders, we open our doors to an unprecedented wave of mass migration that threatens the cohesion of our societies, the continuity of our culture, and the future of our people. This is the national security strategy writ large. We made these mistakes together, and now together we owe it to our people to face those facts and to move forward to rebuild. Under President Trump, the United States of America will once again take on the task of renewal and restoration, driven by a vision of a future as proud, as sovereign, and as vital as our civilization's past. And while we are prepared, if necessary, to do this alone, it is our preference and it is our hope to do this together with you, our friends here in Europe. For the United States and Europe, we belong together. So there's all this we belong together. Let's do stuff together. Yeah. But by the way, the things we want to do together is have ICE kicking out anyone with brown skin out of our countries. We want to say that climate change is a cult and it's not true. And so, X, Y, Z. And it's just okay, this is just Trumpism, but you've dressed it up in nice language saying that, but we want to do this with Europe. Europe's lovely. Gabrielius Landsbergis, the former Lithuanian foreign minister, who's brilliant, said this: a change of tone. Rubio brought a lot of white paint to Munich to cover the cracks caused by the Great Rupture. So, J.D. Vance last year. From the Beatles and Michelangelo to German beer and the common victory in the Cold War. So these are things he talked about in the whole of his speech. He invoked all the symbols of culture that are meant to unite us into a single Western civilization. Europe and the US are connected. That much was clear. But what about the values that once held the transatlantic community together? According to Marco Rubio, international law is no longer working. That was supposed to be holding us together. Other fundamental principles like democracy or true freedom of speech were simply not mentioned. So it is now clear that this is all about interests, not common values. And that's what you saw from the beginning of his speech, where he's talking about, well, or the bit I pointed out, actually, where he's talking about, well, that's the delusion, you know, the rules-based order. Now it should be about national interests. So this is what Gabriela Landsbergis says. So it's now clear that this is all about interests, not common values. And do we actually have common interests? I'm not sure that Europeans see the announced civilizational decline, supposedly caused mainly by migration and deindustrialization, as a core uniting interest. For most Europeans, the common interest is security. And according to the Secretary, Europe has to defend itself on its own, otherwise NATO looks weak. This was not a departure from the general position of the US administration. It was simply delivered in more polite terms. I am not sure the white paint will hold. In other words, Gabriela Landsbergis advocates for this. Marco Rubio said exactly what JD Vance said. He just said it in nicer ways. And I think he's probably quite right there. And I'm sorry to my American friends who are watching this, but you know, I think this was really what was going on. Okay, but then he was actually asked explicitly on stuff like Ukraine and whatnot, and he actually had to mention, heaven forfend, actually had to mention Russia and Ukraine.
I hear your point about, well, the answer is we don't know. We don't know if the Russians are serious about ending the war. They say they are, and under what terms they were willing to do it, and whether we can find terms that are acceptable to Ukraine upon that Russia will always agree to. But we're going to continue to test it. In the meantime, everything else continues to happen. The United States has imposed additional sanctions on Russia's oil. I hear your point.
So that's at least fairly sensible, which is to admit at least that we're not sure we can trust Russia. We don't hear that really from Trump. We certainly don't hear it from, I think, enough from Vance, but Marco Rubio there at least is being pretty honest. Now, Marco Rubio says YouGov, the pollsters, tells the Munich Security Conference that the United States and Europe belong together, but new YouGov data shows that Europeans tend to prioritize autonomy over the US-Europe alliance, and US popularity on the continent is at the lowest since we started tracking in 2016. So do Europeans think it's more important to prioritize European autonomy or preserve the US-Europe alliance? UK plus 20, Italy plus 17, Spain plus 14, Germany plus 11, France plus 3, Poland minus 15. So anyway, yeah, I just think that's worth taking into account. Now, we go on to the speech of... First of all, it was Ursula von der Leyen, then it was Keir Starmer. I'm going to take you to the end of the speech and look at some of the Q&A with Christiane Amanpour, because I think it's really worth doing. So we're going to listen to this. I hope you find this worthwhile. If you've already listened to it, I'm terribly sorry.
Clearly a call to arms, and we can discuss a little bit. But first I want to ask you, there were a couple of applause lines for Secretary of State Marco Rubio. He said, it's neither our wish or our goal to destroy the transatlantic alliance. So I want to know whether you feel convinced by that, whether you feel that the feathers are being, unruffled after last year's broadside, which was exactly the opposite from the American speaker, Vice President J.D. Vance.
So I was very much reassured by the speech of the Secretary of State. We know him. He's a good friend, a strong ally. Indeed, this was for me very reassuring to listen to him. We know that in the administration, some have a harsher tone on these topics, but the Secretary of State was very clear. He said, we want a strong Europe in the alliance. And this is what we are working for intensively in the European Union. We have to be an independent Europe, not a Europe that is leaning on someone, but a Europe that is going forward with friends and allies together, facing the challenges that are out there.
What you'll notice from both von der Leyen and Starmer is, of course, as politicians will do, they have to be diplomatic. So when they're asked about questions, whether there's this rupture between Europe and the US, they have to say, well, Europe has demanded that we stand up on our own 2 feet, and we're going to do that. And so it's like it's cherry picking the bits that they can get away with advocating for from what Marco Rubio and the Americans are saying, whilst also recognizing that there is a change in the future now. There's a change in a relationship, but not overtly or explicitly talking about like a rupture and getting peed off with what, say, Trump or JD Vance or others have said.
And therefore, strong Europe, I completely align with the Secretary of State where that is concerned, but we have to build it. We have to work for it, a strong and independent Europe, to be then a strong ally in NATO, because NATO is consistent then of our friends and allies indeed. But it was also your message. We want a strong Europe. And this is, I think, the message of today, which reflected and was echoed very much in the speech of the Secretary of State.
I thought the Secretary of State's speech was consistent with the argument that Ursula made in her remarks a moment ago and the argument I'm making. I think it's really clear, though, that we shouldn't get in the warm bath of complacency and think that, therefore, all we're really doing is reasserting the continuation of what we've had for the last 80 years. That would be a mistake, and it'd be a particular mistake for Europe, because my strong view is that Europe hasn't done enough in its own defence and security for many years. And the conflict in Ukraine has flushed that out, shown it to be the reality. And it falls to us as leaders to recognise that, to change and strengthen Europe, which is what I'm arguing for, what Ursula is arguing for, and not just say that, but follow it with actions. And Ursula's taken the lead on this in the work that she's done, particularly on the funding of the defence work that needs to be done, because we will only be able to preserve NATO in the way it is needed for the next 80 years if we change and strengthen the European dimension.
So this is to Europeize, as I mentioned in my UK video earlier, the Starmer video earlier, is the idea that NATO needs to be Europeized, and there needs to be a much stronger European contingent. And he talked about that in his speech, Starmer, talking about how in Virginia that there's, now I think British or European command structures in place in NATO there more prominently, and then just ramping up defense spending in Europe. He's very much keen to talk about the funding going to Ukraine, but also the safe mechanism and how the UK wants to be a part of that. And that's why he wants a closer alignment with Europe, because it makes a lot of economic sense for the UK to have that closer alignment. And he wants a massive UK defense industry that we have represented. He talked about it being a quarter of the European defense industry is UK. Obviously, he's advocating for that in terms of getting access to some of that European funding.
That is something which a number of American presidents have said for some time. I believe to be true, and I think we've got to seize this movement to move forward, not to pull apart the transatlantic relationship, but to make sure it works in the circumstances and the times that we face.
Now, I know you want to embrace the United States. You talked about not overly depending, but not also rejecting the US. But you know that the Munich Security Conference doctrine before this conference began talked about an era of demolition politics, demolition men, the politics of destruction, etc., including referencing the President of the United States. A very key American former Republican, he calls himself, analyst has said that America is, under Trump, is playing a role of a hostile and possibly predatory power as well. So Europe is caught between a predatory Russia and a potentially predatory United States.
Now, this is exactly what we've been talking about for weeks now, months, etc. The US has kind of gone the other way with regard to Ukraine. So that's predatory economic power. And then Russia, you've got a predatory, like, bellicose war-like power, imperialist power. And in China, you've got predatory, maybe economic power as well, so on and so forth. And Europe's caught in the middle. That's a well-framed question here. So how do you feel about this, guys?
Have you internalized that? And is that where you are right now in terms of these fighting words that you've just delivered about pretty much total independence? Do you believe that you are between two predatory powers?
There are more threats. First of all, I would never align Russia with the United States. Completely different theaters. But
these were not my words. These were an analyst.
Yeah, okay. So I would not at all confer with this analyst that there's any equidistance between Russia and the United States, very clearly. But of course, the European Union is challenged with superpowers that are outreaching much more than they used to, and many other threats. And Russia is a real threat to us, without any question. So this is the reason why we have to strengthen our own defense posture, why we have to look into the possibilities that we have, for example, with the Article 42.7, while we have to develop our defense industrial base. So independence is action also to be stronger. This also is on the economic side, very clearly diversifying with like-minded partners. The trade agreement we did with India, the trade agreement we have with Mercosur, so the Latin American countries, Mexico, all this is within a strategy to be more independent, more stronger. And independent means to stand up, develop your own strength, be clear with your own weaknesses. Don't look at others to compensate for your own weaknesses. No, be strong, stand up and develop your own strength, and be open to the world and connect with like-minded partners. And of course, a friend and like-minded partner always has been and is the UK on our continent.
So
honestly, I was just thinking here, and I'm sorry to just take this opportunity to slag off Trump again. But honestly, can you imagine Donald Trump giving an answer? I mean, it's not even a first language, an answer as erudite as that, right? Has he ever answered in as intelligent phraseology as Ursula von der Leyen or indeed Keir Starmer? The guy's an absolute gimp. Obama could answer in that way. I think Biden was getting a little bit, he used to be able to answer in that way, but I think he was a little bit old. But Obama is so eloquent and intelligent with the way he answers. They have strategic visions. These guys know what they're talking about. We're going to come on a little bit later to AOC answering in a breakout session, and someone saying, look, she's often slagged off as being a bar woman because that's how MAGA sees her. But listen to her answers. They are absolutely on the money. And just imagine Donald Trump saying the words that you hear either of these people say. He's not even on the same freaking page. And it's so sad that the United States of America, this incredible country, this country that is a beacon for so many things, is being run by someone who can't join sentences and ideas together, that doesn't actually have the breadth and depth of knowledge that these guys do to be able to answer these sorts of questions. Honestly, tell me, and I've said this to you 100 times before, give me an example of an answer Donald Trump has ever been, that he's ever given, that is granular in detail and shows real depth and breadth of knowledge of any subject. There is none. He's never done it. He's never done it. The guy speaks in vaguenesses and in a complete lack of detail. And he just can't do this. He cannot do this. And as someone said earlier, just in the live chat, why is this journalist, Christiane Amanpour, she's a CNN journalist, but why does she get, these guys getting asked proper questions? Trump is never in these positions. When have you seen Trump sat down at a session like this and asked really in-depth questions that he gives really in-depth answers to? And it just doesn't happen because he's not capable of doing it.
Prime Minister, you laid out how Britain has come to the defense and to the joint military action with its allies for a long, long time. But the current Secretary General of NATO, after Trump's Davos speech, actually after Prime Minister Carney's speech, which talked about a rupture, he said, if you all are thinking that you can do what you have to do without the United States, then dream on. It's not going to happen. So how long do you think it'll take to get to this posture that you both say you need to get to?
And I'm not apologizing for showing this Q&A, because honestly, Amanpour here is asking really bloody good questions. This is the stuff we need to be talking about, which is the relationship between all these entities. And she's asking some really important questions to some really important people, Ursula von der Leyen and Keir Starmer, one from the EU, one from just outside the EU, but from Europe as a whole. And I think this is a really, really good discussion. Of course, they're going to give diplomatic politician answers, but this is a conversation that should be happening and that we should be a party to.
Well, the first thing I'd say is that we're not looking at a future that tears us apart from the Euro-Atlantic alliance that we have. NATO has been the single most effective and successful military alliance the world has ever known, and we should never move away from it. I often and always base my thinking on what is the reality on the ground. And the reality on the ground, so far as the UK is concerned, is we are working with the US on defence, security and intelligence 24/7, every single day. So that is the reality of what is happening. And that is as tight now as it's ever been. And I see no sign of that weakening, nor should it, because that's in the interests of the United Kingdom and the interests of Europe and globally. And that goes into defence, security, intelligence, obviously nuclear capability as well. And therefore, I'm often urged back in my own parliament that we should walk away from what we've got. And I reject that. But I think simply sitting where we are isn't good enough. And therefore, the change does need to come. That needs Europe to be stronger, to be working more closely together. And that's why I said what I said about the UK-EU relationship. We're 10 years on from Brexit. We are not the Britain of the Brexit years. We're a Britain that wants to work with the EU even more closely in light of the challenge that we face here 10 years on. That will take time. We are working together. We had a very good UK-EU summit last year. We will have another one this year where we can make further steps forward. But this is of some urgency because I think that on defence and security, until the Ukraine conflict, we didn't really wake up to the reality that we're facing.
And I actually do obviously want to...
So, good answer. Perfectly happy with that. Just this idea from Dinogetic, who says, but to be honest, I'd rather have an honest, dumb answer than a diplomatic politician lie. And I get that idea. The thing with Trump is it's both a dumb and a lie. So it's not that he's honest and dumb. He is a liar first and foremost, and he's dumb.
Into Ukraine because you raised it very clearly towards the beginning of your speech, but you also said, and I want to get to the bottom of this, that some red lines have been crossed and they cannot be uncrossed. You were talking about the United States in your speech, I think. What red lines are you talking about? Because there is a massive deficit of trust between many people in the alliance and certainly leaders who are now having to do what you're doing, workarounds, de-risking, decoupling, whatever you might want to call it, independence. What red lines have been crossed that cannot be uncrossed?
So, for example, I want to be very clear, our digital sovereignty is our digital sovereignty. Very clear on that one.
Some people are talking about there being a bit of choppiness at all. There's no great issues for my internet.
And we have a long tradition in freedom of speech. Actually, the Enlightenment started on our continent. And we are very clear with digital sovereignty also that what is forbidden offline is forbidden online. And we will not flinch what that is concerned. We will be very steadfast to pursue this very clear demand for us. But if I may also look at the quote of the Secretary General of NATO, dream on. I would like to tell him, my dear friend, no, my dear friend, there's not only status quo goes on or division and disruption. There is a lot in between. And status quo is not satisfactory, neither for us, nor for the United States. So there is much more in between, and an independent Europe just means let's develop our strength without constantly leaning on someone else, and then being strong, moving forward and facing the challenges the world is offering to us. This is what I want to tell my friend Mark Rutte.
Prime Minister, in terms of, President von der Leyen talked about the digital space. That is a red line that cannot be, messed around with. What about the violating international borders space? Do you believe the US threat to Greenland is over? That was a red line for you. It all seemed to stiffen all of your collective spines and you got kind of moving on it. Do you think the threat is over?
Well, I think that, firstly, I'm very pleased that that is now in a process of dialogue, which is where it should have been. The security in the Arctic is really important for all of us, and we need to do more. That's why I announced what I announced about the Carrier Strike Group. I thought that those weeks of Greenland were quite instructive because we had, certainly from the British point of view, the usual mix of common sense, pragmatism, but sticking to our values and principles. And across Europe, we stuck to those values and principles about sovereignty and why sovereignty matters. And it was a period in which there was intense collaboration and discussion amongst European leaders as to how we would approach the issue. And I was very pleased that we did it in the way that we did, as I say, a mix, as ever, with the Brits of pragmatism and common sense, but with saying these are the lines, these are our principles, these are our values, and that requires us to be absolutely clear about the question of sovereignty. And now it is in a process of discussion and dialogue focused, in my view, where it should be, which is on security in the Arctic, which is a pressing issue and an issue where we all need to do more.
About Ukraine, because again, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, barely mentioned it except for an elusive peace. He said those words. Now, President Trump has said in his latest comments that Ukraine, President Zelenskyy needs to get onto it because Russia wants a deal. These are his words. And President Zelenskyy needs to get onto it right now. Otherwise, he's going to miss a great opportunity. Secretary Rubio did not go to your meeting, your leaders' meeting with President Zelenskyy last night. Where do you think this all stands? Where do the negotiations stand? Is it Zelenskyy who needs to be pressured?
So I think it's extremely important that we do not buy in the Russian narrative. And this has been out too much there. I mean, if we look at the strategic goals and the military goals of Putin, it's a huge failure. He wanted to Russify Ukraine. Ukraine has become European. He wanted to stop NATO. NATO has gotten bigger with Sweden and Finland. He wanted to occupy Ukraine within days or weeks. Well, now we are unfortunately in the 4th year of the war. And I think it is so important that we, on our side, tell the truth, what is going on in Russia, with a war economy, with skyrocketing interest rates and inflation, completely isolated. And now this is a war of attrition. And in this war of attrition, it is of utmost importance that we push forward the negotiations and put pressure on Putin that he finally comes to the negotiation table. And therefore, it was so valuable that we have developed together the security guarantees, the prosperity paper, and are discussing the 20-point plan, because it is of utmost importance that Ukraine, the European Union, and the United States are on one side of the page, that we are very clear what our standpoint is. This has very much matured, and now it's a matter of putting pressure on Putin that he comes. He avoids, of course, the negotiation table because he does not want to sit down to have peace, which is absolutely abhorrent. So therefore, the pressure we put on him, and the economy is at the limit.
So this is really important that Ursula von der Leyen, Europeans, and we heard this a number of times at the Munich Security Conference, that Russia is on the brink of a recession. I would argue they're already there. But she is saying that, the pressure needs to be put onto Russia here. And I think that it's about reading between the lines. There is certainly, she's positioning Europe against what the United States is positioning itself as, with regard to the Trump administration. Like, this is what needs to happen, which is to say this isn't happening, and the US unfortunately is not advocating for that.
Is the one way really to make progress in getting to the negotiation table to peace talks?
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's very important. In 10 days is the 4-year anniversary of the beginning of the conflict. And it is therefore important to remind ourselves who the aggressor is. The aggressor is Russia. And the quickest way for this conflict to end is for Russia to stop its aggression. And therefore, we're not dealing with two equal parties. There's an aggressor, which is Russia, and there is Ukraine, which has been subject to attack and killing and bombing and taken a huge or paid a huge price. I agree with Ursula that actually, if you look at the situation on the ground, it was a huge strategic error for Putin. He thought he would take Ukraine in a matter of weeks. And here we are 4 years later, and he has by no means achieved his end, and he has had the opposite effect. The NATO summit last year was the biggest and the strongest with the greatest resolve for many, many years. So NATO is stronger. Russia's lost, as I mentioned a moment ago, 1 million lives.
Casualties, not lives.
For this conflict. In January this year, I think I'm right in saying 30,000 died on the front line. That is why we're all working for a just and lasting peace. But it will only be just and lasting if the security guarantees, because we've had a cessation of hostilities before, but without anything sitting behind it. And one thing we know about Putin, if nothing sits behind it, he'll go again, which is why we set up the coalition, the willing to work on security guarantees. I'm really pleased we're working with the US on that. Actually, another example, whatever words are used by different individuals in different parts of the globe, the practical reality is we're working with the Americans on the security guarantees, and we're more advanced now than we were 3 months ago. And I'm really pleased that we're in a better position.
That's an important point, actually, and worthy of note that, you know, here's an example. So we have received confirmation from the American side that they are ready to ratify security guarantees for Ukraine in Congress. So there might be things happening with regard to the United States that are happening irrespective of what you hear from Trump and from JD Vance and from wingnuts who don't know their arse from their elbow. It might be that Pentagon officials, army officials are actually doing things. And that might also include, by the way, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. And there might be different movements happening underneath the radar. So, for example, we are hearing an internal Kremlin memo is outlining a potential economic reset with the Trump administration, including a dramatic return to the US dollar settlement system if a Ukraine peace deal is reached. So the Russians are doing very clever things to sweeten Donald Trump and to appeal to Donald Trump. Oh, we'll embrace the dollar system again if you do a peace deal that suits us. And this is why you see Trump keeping on saying, putting all the pressure on Zelenskyy. Last night he said, it's up to Zelenskyy to get this deal done, and no pressure on Russia at all. But it could then be that actually behind the scenes, the American Pentagon is working with allies to make sure that decent security guarantees are put in place. Putin is trying to play Trump for a fool once more. He's offering a lot more vague economic promises with large dollar values to bribe Trump, says Maria Drutska, but none will ever realistically happen since Russia is now China's economic vassal. There's probably a Moscow Trump Tower in there too. Russian memo sees return to dollar system in pitch made for Trump. You know, the Russians are clever. They know that Trump can be bought, that he is very easy to manipulate. But then the problem is you get people like Scott Bessant actually just kind of following along. Quote, the USA may lift sanctions on Russian oil in the event of a peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine. According to the American minister, such a scenario could significantly affect the global energy market and lead to a drop in oil prices. So there's still this kind of like willingness from people at the top to let Russia off the hook, so on and so forth. But then you've got Congress that I think are much more responsible in general. So, you know, we've got the idea that Congress might ratify security negotiations or security guarantees. US Congress, according to The Hill, will consider a bill on sanctions against foreign individuals and companies that help import Russian oil. Initiative was introduced by bipartisan congressmen. The document will increase pressure on Russia and provide for restrictions for participants in such deals. So yeah, all this kind of stuff is potentially going on behind the scenes to some degree. It's worth noting that the new negotiating team for the Russians is now going to be headed by someone that is not respected at all, a wingnut, and they're actually going to send 15, I think, delegates to the trilateral talks in Switzerland, in Geneva. Kremlin says Medinsky, who's this wingnut historian bloke, is returning to lead the Russian delegation at the trilateral Geneva talks. So much for recent signs of substance, with negotiations seemingly headed back to this hollow pseudo-historical lectures on Rurik and the Pechenegs, says War Translated. So not a guy that is particularly well respected. Okay, so anyway, I thought I'd throw that in there as well. Just to finish up the last remarks here, last couple of seconds.
I need to ask you a political question.
So then actually we're going to finish there, because then Emmanuel asked him about, Reform UK and your political difficulties in last week. And he said, look, I finished stronger at the end of this week than I started that week. And, we're united in supporting Ukraine across all the political groups in parliament, apart from Reform. He said Reform had their own kind of pro-Russian agenda, but other than that, we're all united behind Ukraine, as we were in the last government of the Conservatives, where the Labour Party supported the Conservative government on Ukraine, and that's great sort of bipartisan support. Anyway, then when we go to listen to another American at the Munich Security Conference, here we have Gavin Newsom talking very much in traditional terms. You can only influence Putin with strength, not weakness. Gavin Newsom said that the US must act more decisively in supporting Ukraine. He recalled the partnership between the state of California and Ukraine, in particular National Guard with Ukrainian military. You cannot be an accomplice. You need to organize much more decisively and support the Ukrainian people during this war. So, there's a vaguely sensible person from the American political establishment. Now, here we're going to get on to talking about AOC, and AOC's on the money here. Like, honestly, just pretty good stuff here from AOC. Considering she's seen, and I think she's become much less super progressive, as in the more seriously she's been entertained as a politician, the more she's actually been more measured in her responses, and understanding the difficulties of marrying up truly progressive politics with, say, NATO, with international standing, and so on and so forth. So Mehdi Hassan, though, on the money here, says it amuses me that MAGA think that their attack line on AOC going forward can be, oh, she's just a bartender, because when she was at university, she worked in a bar. Well, yeah, but she graduate cum laude in some legal, I forget what degree she has, but she's just a bartender, or she's dumb. When I can't think of a single MAGA congressman who could speak like this for 2 minutes on this topic at an international forum like Munich, not one. And he's absolutely right. I'm going to go back to this particular exchange, though, which I think she's on the money here.
To international aid, not just US.
Sorry, I need to go back a little bit further.
Just a 20-second follow-up, really just quick. Are there any particular institutions that a democratic administration would want to save? Like your voters, is it NATO? Is it the climate accord? Is it the Iran nuclear? Are there some things where, just give me a lily pad?
Well, first and foremost, I think we need to revisit our commitments to international aid, not just USAID, but the dozens of global compacts that this current Secretary of State and President Trump have withdrawn from. They are looking to withdraw the United States from the entire world so that we can turn into an age of authoritarians that can carve out the world where Donald Trump can command the Western Hemisphere and Latin America as his personal sandbox, where Putin can saber rattle around Europe and and try to bully around our own allies there, and for essentially authoritarians to have their own geographic domains. And it actually is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It is our global alliances that can be a hard stop against authoritarian consolidation of power, particularly in the installation of regional puppet governments.
Boom. She's like absolutely on the money there. Like, it's NATO, it's the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it's you know, the US and Europe, or the US and Japan and Australia. You know, that's what will stop, hopefully, authoritarian governments like China and Russia expanding their power base around particular regions. I think she's absolutely right there. And here she is again. This is what Mehdi Hassan was referring to.
Yes, that's absolutely right. You know, I think one of the connections and relationships that is under discussed, particularly in the security space, is the fact that I believe we're seeing an economy around the world, including in the United States, that extreme levels of income inequality lead to social instability and drives, in a sense, in authoritarianism, right-wing populism, and very dangerous domestic internal politics. And that is a direct outcome of not just income inequality, but the failure of democracies over decades to deliver. The failure to deliver higher wages, the failure to rein in corporations. You know, the point was just made about antitrust. In the United States, antitrust is such a foundational bedrock value, not just because the ascent of monopolies create the abuse of power in corporations and market power, but there is a level of market concentration and corporate consolidation where a massive company can get so big that its consolidated power can rival that of nation states.
Now, imagine Donald Trump saying something like this. Like, she's just so much more cogent than Trump. And she's talking about, like, say, Elon Musk, the power that Elon Musk has with his corporations, almost monopolistic in certain domains like SpaceX, and the contracts that they're getting from the US government, that Musk himself is as powerful as many nation states around the world.
In democracies, we have elected leaders, and in massive corporations that then begin to consume the public sector, gobble up these spending, they start to call the shots. And we're starting to see this with some of the billionaire class throwing their weight around in domestic politics and in global politics as well. So it is of utmost urgent priority that we get our economic houses in order and deliver material gains for the working class, or else we will fall to a more isolated world governed by authoritarians that also do not deliver to working people.
So it's really interesting that she's joining up a progressive politics there with how to fight against authoritarianism, the rise of what she would see as right-wing populism. Now, it's interesting here, Adam Mockler, himself a progressive YouTuber, says AOC and Gavin Newsom are representing the USA gracefully in Munich. Meanwhile, Trump is seething and praising Viktor Orban, which is exactly what's happening. So while all this is happening, Trump is just saying how wonderful Viktor Orban is. Pretty incredible. But yeah, I think AOC, and you know, I'm not attacking, when I criticize Trump and the American administration, I'm criticizing Trump and the American administration. I think there are many decent American politicians out there. Unfortunately, they're just not in power at the moment. So I'm not anti-American, I am anti-Trump and anti that kind of rabid populism that is so dangerous for the world. You know, it is really important that we get that right. So anyway, just to, I guess, finish off here, I've got so much more to say, but I'll keep it with sort of Zelenskyy then. So Zelenskyy then spoke at the Munich Security Conference, and let's use Max 25 summarizing a lot of what he said. So Zelenskyy received a standing ovation. He said Pearl exists thanks to Europe. So in other words, the initiative that buys weaponry off the United States exists thanks to Europe. Europe is paying for that, right? So the US is just selling it. Europe pays for our ability to stop ballistic strikes. Intelligence says that a new massive Russian strike on Ukraine could happen in a day or two. British Defense Minister In fact, no, I need to. I'm just wondering. Yeah. No, sorry. Anyway, I'm going to carry on. So when the Iranian regime first gave Russian Shahed drones to Russia, Shahed drones, they were simple weapons and could be shut down easily. Now they are different. They have jet engines. They can fly at different altitudes. They can be guided by an operator in real time and use Starlink to reach their targets. They can even carry and deploy other FPV drones. Ukraine does not share a border with Iran, and we have never had a conflict of interest with the Iranian regime. But the Iranian Shahed drones they sold to Russia are killing, especially our people, Ukrainians, and destroying our infrastructure. The Iranian regime has already done and can still do more harm than many other regimes could in a century. And yet this regime still exists and it hopes to survive everything, even this crisis. So a bit of a statement about Iran there. Air defense missiles that were delivered on Sunday were used on Thursday. So that's how desperate they are. We will reach the point where we produce enough interceptors to make Shahed drones meaningless for Russia. There is no country in Europe that can rely only on its own technology and money to defend. That's why we rely on Europe and allies, Australia and Canada and the US to help us. So he had this really famous dig at Viktor Orban. So he said only Viktor Orban can only think about how to grow his belly, not how to grow his army to stop Russian tanks from returning to the streets of Budapest. This then drew a response from Viktor Orban, by the way. But there's quite a personal dig at Orban, who is certainly growing his belly. And I think gorging himself on European money at the expense of his people in Hungary. We hope that Trump hears us, said Zelenskyy. We hope Congress hears us. American people hear us, and we are grateful for the real help, for all the real help. In other words, he's not getting real help from Trump, and he's not getting real help from Congress at the moment. And he's absolutely right. Putin may see himself as a Tsar, but in reality, he is a slave to war. And if he lives another 10 years, he could regroup, rebuild, and expand again. Putin does not live like ordinary people. He cannot imagine life without power or after power. Normal things do not interest him. Putin consults more with Tsar Peter and Empress Catherine about territorial games than with any living person about real life. Can you imagine Putin without war? What else? The Ukrainian army is the strongest army in Europe, thanks to our heroes, and I think it is simply not smart to keep this army outside NATO. Just in December, our forces eliminated 35,000 occupying soldiers, killed and severely wounded. So interestingly, he's now said that they are killed and wounded. Before he had said they were killed. That's an interesting distinction. In January, there were fewer Russian assaults, and as a result, Russia's losses were about 30,000 killed and badly wounded. There is even a clear price Russia pays for every kilometer of occupied Ukrainian land in the Donetsk front. The price net Russia now pays for each kilometer is 156 soldiers. Every month, Russia mobilizes about 40,000 people, sometimes a little more. For our army, the mission is clear: to destroy our Russian occupiers, and our goal is specific, at least 50,000 a month. We truly hope that trilateral meetings next week will be serious and substantive, helpful for all of us. But honestly, sometimes it feels like sides are talking about completely different things. The Americans are often return to the topic of concessions, and too often those concessions are discussed only in the context of what Ukraine should give, not Russia. Europe is practically not present at the table. That's a big mistake. In my view, it truly is. There you go. That's the key. The US is making Ukraine concede. It's not demanding anything of Russia, and we need Europe at the table to help defend our own interests. Putin hopes to repeat Munich, not Munich 2007, when they only spoke about dividing Europe, but Munich 1938, when the previous Putin began dividing Europe in reality. Previous Putin, Hitler. Ukraine is ready for a deal, one that brings real peace to Ukraine and in Europe. It's wrong to assume that this is a permanent arrangement, that others can stay safe behind Ukraine forever. Ukrainians are people, not terminators. Are you feeling the pressure by Trump? A little bit, he answers. Yeah. The American side proposed a free economic zone. We said we are ready to look at such proposals. It is our territory. It has to remain our territory. We cannot just withdraw. There are 200,000 Ukrainians living there. It's our land. We simply cannot run away. We are ready to talk about a free economic zone. Maybe it could be something important for compromises and for the reconstruction of Ukraine. We are ready to take steps. What are the Russians ready to do? We do not hear any compromises from the Russian side. We want to hear something from them. And of course, that demands that the US puts pressure on them. Mark Rutte said on Russia, they lost 65,000 people in December and January. They are not winning this. They make very small gains in Donetsk and other places, so small that they are almost irrelevant, but they lose all these people. If there is a dictator in Moscow willing to do that, then we are dealing with someone who is ready to sacrifice so many of his own people in this war. We have to take that seriously because this is crazy behavior. Putin is again sending his historian next week to talk in Geneva, where he will lecture Ukrainians about Sweden or whatever. So already, not looking good for the peace negotiations. And as Zelenskyy said on elections, this is interesting. I see comparisons. They say they had elections during the Civil War with Lincoln. How can we compare that to us? Our people are under missiles. It's not just a land war. We are under ballistic attacks. Give us a ceasefire. We can also give a ceasefire for Russians if they do elections in Russia. And this was met with quite a laugh. Ukraine urgently needs missiles for Patriot and other defense, blah, blah, blah. But he said, look, we can have a ceasefire. We can have a ceasefire so Russia can have elections because they need free and fair elections. Anyway, that's pretty much a synopsis of what Zelenskyy said. Just seeing Gerashchenko here saying Ukraine didn't choose this war, well, actually Zelenskyy, and it's wrong to assume that this is a permanent arrangement. That's, as we heard actually already from Max 25, so that's pretty good. Now, talking about Orban, so Viktor Orban was brought up by Zelenskyy there, and just before we finish this, Merz also brought up Viktor Orban.
My second remark is the following. There was somebody from the European Union, a prime minister, who traveled to Moscow on his own. This is almost 2 years ago. He had no mandate. He went there. He achieved nothing.
That's Orban.
And the week after, we saw the heaviest attacks on civil infrastructure, on private homes, on hospitals we had ever seen until this time. So if it makes sense to talk, we are willing to talk. But as you can see with the American side, Russia is not yet willing to talk seriously. And my personal guess is, this is my personal view, that this war will only end when Russia is at least economically, potentially militarily exhausted.
Exactly, 100%. So Zelenskyy said, look, I had a good meeting with senators in Munich. We value their support for Ukraine and for our warriors. He met, I think, so here you've got Lindsey Graham, you've got Blumenthal. He's presented them with stuff. I briefed them on Russia's massive attacks on Ukraine's energy system. I think Keith Kellogg was there as well. Our needs for recovery and additional air defense missiles for protection. We also discussed the negotiation process and meetings of the negotiating teams. I think the senators, I thank them for supporting this position, for their willingness to pass a bill on sanctions against Russia in the near future. We also went over the work on security guarantees for Ukraine. The clarity and precise understanding on each point are crucial for our society's trust in the security guarantees document. For all Ukrainians, it is vital that the security guarantees are ratified by US Congress. So it has to go through Congress because otherwise it's just Trump's word, and that's not really worth it. Finally, and I haven't heard too much from Mette Frederiksen, but this was interesting. Denmark's prime minister has called for strikes deep inside Russia, saying that the Russians only understand strength. You cannot win a war by having weapons on your shoulders. Ukraine must receive everything it needs to win. This is what I've said since the beginning of the war. Ukraine prevails in this war with distance munitions flying into Russia. That's how they win the war. I'm just going to finally go to something. This isn't actually anything from the Munich Security Conference. This is someone speaking in the European Parliament. But actually, Truth Matters here says, I firmly believe that the United States of Europe is now a geopolitical imperative and that the UK should be part of it. There is now a majority in the UK to rejoin the EU, and I believe now the time is to make this happen. It's costing £100 billion every year for this failed right-wing vanity project that would simply makes the UK weaker. Now, I don't know that's going to happen, and we are going to get a rerunning of the Brexit debate for sure. But this is I like this sentiment from this European politician.
I grew up being a strong believer in international law, but now I see this might have been an idle hope. We live in a Trumpian world where only power seems to matter. And we used to abide by international law, but only when the US wanted it. These times are scary, but let me be clear. We don't have to stand by and watch. I want to address our prime ministers and presidents directly. Because you want Europe to be strong, but you don't show the courage to make it happen. You want a bit more collaboration, but you won't risk your political position to make real reform happen. You want just enough change for Europe to survive, but not enough for Europe to succeed. As you are gathering in a castle in Brussels this week, I urge you, walk the road to European independence. Get rid of the veto and speak with one voice. Be the leader in upholding human rights and find new allies who want the same. Be ambitious and build the United States of Europe.
Interesting there. And I wonder, like, getting rid of the veto, having unanimous voting so that Hungary can veto things, that's clearly a problem, and that will need to be looked at, of course. Look, that's enough from me on all of these matters. It's been a long one. Apologies. And sorry that apparently there were issues with the videos that I was showing, luckily not the audio. Some comments that you guys have made throughout the course of this. Thanks to Benny for picking these out. Richard Bennett saying, where was reform? So UK political party, right-wing populists who have, I think, been compromised by Russia. We had a Russian influence debate in Parliament recently, and reform didn't even turn up to the debate. So where were they during that debate? Were they grifting? Almost certainly. Alan MTB says, it seems to me that more often than not, the easiest way to outfox Trump is to do what he asks. Careful what you wish for, Donald. Yeah, so, yeah, if you want Europe to stand on its own 2 feet, then okay, let's do it. Oh, look, you know, if he wants tariffs, yeah, go and have tariffs. Tariffs are against everyone. Oh, look, your economy is getting screwed over it. So, you know, yeah, there is an element to that. Star Wars comes across like the awkward person at parties who doesn't quite know how to socialize. I should know. Nice one, Paul. Sereni. Michael Vuchar, thank you very much for your ATP Geopolitics memberships. Thank you, mate. Really appreciate it. As Bob Zula says, Senator Kelly is the man. He is, I think, a decent politician, Mark Kelly, I have to say. Russian forces attacked the production line for Flamingo missiles. I'm going to talk about this tomorrow, King Raccoon. I've got that in for my video for tomorrow. So there is now evidence that exactly like I've been saying for some time, that military-industrial places have been hit inside Ukraine. I'm going to just rush through a few more of these. Putin puppet, Musk, Doge data, Palantir, etc., ICE. All Epstein related, can arrest any group of Americans they renamed from protesters to terrorists. Yeah, what's going on in the US is, I think, authoritarian. And I think, you know, AOC's probably got a lot to say about that for sure. Wonder how many, so Viggo Holmson, wonder how many more countries will join the nuclear club. Several European countries are likely to manufacture their own. There are some saying that if Germany and Poland really wanted to research nuclear weaponry, they'll probably be able to get nuclear weapons pretty quickly, you know, all things considered. Yeah, so yes. Okay, please like, share, please subscribe, share, and like. It is free. Let's get this great channel and guy to 100,000 subscribers. Thanks to Pirate, really appreciate that. And also join Blue Sky, please, and share there too. Yeah, for sure. Thanks, really appreciate that, Pirate. Putin puppet, Musk improved Starlink for Ukraine after France did raid the office and he found out, and the tech bros market, etc., outside the US. So that's one thing there. Second thing, the EU and others are far bigger than the relatively small US market. Regulations work very well. Palantir, etc., is warned. Well, I don't know. The US is relatively small. I mean, the US is a bigger market than Europe. Well, it depends what metrics you use, of course. It's bigger GDP. But anyway, yeah. Thank you very much, Putin puppet. And I think something I didn't show you there was an answer that I think she might have, or did she say that? Did she talk about tech sovereignty, Ursula von der Leyen? There was a certain question she was asked. I can't remember if I showed it in this video or the last one, or I haven't showed it to you at all. But she talks about how Europe big thing. The red line for Europe is tech sovereignty. And that is really, really important. I think it might have been the last thing that was said before the end, so I don't think I showed it to you, unfortunately. But that's a red line for Europe. So I think there's going to be a lot of shenanigans going forward with regard to tech sovereignty and American big tech. Michael Future, how many times do I have to say this? China wants a split between Europe and the USA. It's yes, absolutely, and yep, I agree with you. That's exactly what they want, and they also want European disunity, the EU to fall apart. I think that's in the best interest of Russia, China, and actually an imperialistic looking United States as well. Pirate, sorry I never have any good questions because I always ask about if China is going to take Manchuria instead of Taiwan, cheaper and easier. Thank you very much, the Pirate. Thank you. You don't always have to ask good questions, but you're supporting the channel. I really, really appreciate that. As a non-US citizen in the US, I understand why some Iranians have the deeply negative feelings toward the US. They are imperialists in sheep clothing. It's an interesting thing about Iranians. So Iranian protesters were really bigging up Trump, and they were loving Trump because he said he was going to come and rescue them. And of course, that didn't really happen, and the strikes never took place, and they still could. But there was a lot of disappointment, as far as I can work out, from Iranian protesters who were thinking that their savior was going to be Donald Trump there, and it never quite came to be. But thank you very much to Alsace 1977. Pirate, peace prize for Kaja. Kaja Kallas is great. I do like her as a politician. And the Pirate, again, if the US pulls away from Ukraine, is the mineral deal dead? I would hope so. That's interesting. I wonder whether that is formally put in place now, because it's a legally binding agreement. I would have thought so. I don't know if there are any clauses that were put in place if one nation was to pull away, whether there could be any ramifications there. Alsace, I believe Canada and the EU are and will continue to be leaders in combating climate change. Yes, they need to force the US to comply. Yeah, interesting point. I think Canada is still trying to do the good thing there. Mitch Ashdown from Canada, speaking of which, consider perhaps Trump is a created caricature of the maggot race. Ouch. Thanks, Mitch. Kevin Forth gifting 5 ATP Geopolitics memberships. Thank you, my friend. The more I learn about Ursula, the more I like her, says Jiri Kraus from the Czech Republic, from Czechia. Thank you, Jiri. Really appreciate that. The Pirate, last one for the Ukraine Wine Fund. Thank you very much. That is a very important fund. Jiri Kraus, tomorrow there will be more protests in all of Czechia. That's interesting. Thanks for giving me the heads up on that. Yeah, it's a place to watch, Czechia, at the moment, because yeah, it is certainly seemingly placing itself very much in the Russian sphere of influence. Although I think Babiš, as many people have said, is not necessarily pro-Russian, but he's quite opportunistic. But the couple of the other parties he's in coalition with are more pro-Russian prima facie. Donating is courageous. Slava Ukraini. Contagious is not courageous at all. It is contagious. Thank you, Ronnie. I appreciate that, mate. Thanks to all of you supporting the channel. Goose Springsteen. Hey, JP. I'm working. Just a drive-by super chat to say thanks for all you do. Enjoy half a pint on me. Thanks, Goose. Really appreciate that. Half a pint. You must be living in London. I really appreciate that, Goose. Thank you. For me, that's a full pint. Just a bit for your Ukrainian wine fund. I think there's a theme going on here. Worth chasing down some Moldovan brandy too. I recommend White Stork if you can find it. Thanks, Paul. My parents are big brandy drinkers. I'm not so much, but I'd take that on board. Thank you, Paul, for your support. And Dry Chaff says, thanks for bringing all this to us and its significance. I'll contribute to Ukrainian Fund too. Thank you very much for all of your support. M. de Wilde, Margaret, thank you. Thanks, Jonathan, and the great community. Thank you from Canada. I really appreciate your support. Long time viewer from my old channel as well, my philosophical channel. So thank you. And yes, goodness me, sorry about the issues with the viewing. 144p, that's how good the visuals were. So yeah, lucky you. But no, thanks to all the super chatters. And please remember, of course, more importantly, atpgeo.com/donate. You can get yourself a Doris patch there by helping out Car for Ukraine. That is super appreciated. Never apologize, please, mate. We love your work. Yeah, but sometimes I do bang on too long. And this is probably one of those incidents. Rise up the checks. Okay. Mitch Mazarol, Canadian friend here, just arrived in time to rewind to the start of the stream. Thanks for the relentless efforts. Sometimes it feels relentless. I was saying to my missus today, like, oh Jesus, can people stop doing shit? I like, you know, and yeah, Munich Security Conference, I didn't think could produce so much content for me to talk about, but it's also important. It's like shaping the future of our world, shaping the relationships between Europe and, well, the EU and UK, Europe and the US, China, Russia, you know, so on and so forth. It is all happening. Thank you to Penny Pie for being behind the scenes here. I haven't gone through all the comments that he's put up because I probably need to let you go and get back to my missus. She's literally knitting a cardigan for the little baby in the house. So her daughter's had a baby. Well, now it's over a year old. And she's literally like a granny knitting on the sofa, listening to an audiobook. So I best go and keep her company and remind her that I do actually exist, and that although you guys are my family as well, the real family is the missus and the boys. So anyway, I appreciate all of your support, guys. It does keep the lights on, and it is absolutely great. But please remember atpgeo.com/donate. I don't know. I sometimes wonder, am I making a difference, Tomasz? I mean, I like to think I am making a difference in these dark times. I do think sometimes I'm like when I think about Keir Starmer, how everyone seems to hate him, and I speak to my parents and my missus' parents, and I'm like, yeah, but does it really warrant that much hate? And he's like, actually, like, he's doing quite sensible stuff in Europe, and you know, and I feel like I'm advocating and trying to make a difference, but not trying to do it for a political party or anything. I'm not a political party guy, but like, I just want there to be fairness and righteousness in Europe and in the world, and I want Ukraine to be supported, and I want them to prevail, and I want justice to take place. And you know, I have a YouTube channel that I'm shouting about that every day. Does it make a difference? I don't know. I hope it does, but thank you for being here. Let's imagine it does, and then I can sleep well tonight or something. Shut up, Pierce. Get on with it. Take care, everybody. Big love. See you soon.